Content warning. This episode includes discussion of violence and murder.
The Long Island serial killer case has been on many of our minds ever since that moment in July when Rex Heuermann was arrested and charged with the murders of Megan Waterman, Melissa Barthelemy, and Amber Costello, and named as a suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes.
Robert Kolker, though, has been covering this case far longer than that. He's been on the story for over a decade. He's the author of Lost Girls, an account of the case which puts the focus squarely on the victims. This book was named by Time magazine as one of the best true crime books of all time, and was even adapted into a Netflix feature film.
Now that an arrest has been made, we wanted to reach out to him, find out how he wrote the book, and get his opinion on some of the other controversies that have long swirled around this case. What about the other bodies found nearby? Does he believe they were murdered by the same killer? Shannan Gilbert vanished from the same area where the bodies were found after calling for help. Was she a victim of a murder, or is there another explanation for her death? We also wanted to know what he thought of the once popular theory that former Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke was somehow involved in the killings. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is Discussing the Long Island Serial Killer with Lost Girls author Robert Kolker.
I guess to jump in, we understand, you covered the case of these missing and murdered women before the book came out, obviously, for New York Magazine. And we were wondering, can you talk a bit about how you first started reporting out these stories?
Sure. The finished product is it's technically a true crime book, but it's a very unusual true crime book, right? There's no solution in the book. Although I guess that'll have to change sooner or later. But at the time it came out, it was not exactly what people were thinking a true crime book ought to be. And there hadn't been a lot of unusual true crime yet. It was a year or two before Serial, a year or two before Making a Murderer, and before true crime really got revolutionized in the modern era. So I also was kind of puzzled about how to proceed. The case broke. I was on staff at New York Magazine. I'd covered criminal justice stories before. I'd written crime stories before. I'd even written crime stories out on Long Island before. I had a car and lived in Brooklyn, and so that made me a good person for them to send. I wrote about a murder in the Hamptons, and later on I wrote about the Bad Superintendent, the superintendent in Roslyn, Long Island, that later became the movie Bad Education. So I kept going out there, but this was different because it was an unsolved mystery. And I also was rather intimidated because I had no police sources out there, and it was clear they weren't really talking anyway to anyone about what was going on, as they kept finding more and more victims in the case. So I wasn't sure what to do, even as a magazine story. Over the months, it revealed itself to me because I found another angle, which was the families. I had initially thought that perhaps the victims would never be identified, that they had fallen off the grid, that they were like, subplots in a true crime story. But in fact, real life is different from that, and they were identified. And not only that, their families had been looking for them, and the police for years hadn't necessarily been working so hard to find them until suddenly it was a notorious serial killer case. And that was a really interesting and peculiar thing to talk about with my editor. Yeah, he and I talked, and I said, it's the weirdest thing. You've got these sisters and mothers who have lost someone dear to them, who was leading a risky life, but who basically was alive one day and gone the next, someone they were in steady touch with, someone who had responsibilities in a life. And the police really didn't lift a finger, and some of them couldn't even get on the National Registry of Missing Persons. And then suddenly, once it's a big serial killer case, everything changes and the spotlight is on these people, and the whole world now is beating a path to their door, and they're excited because they think there might be a break in the case because of it, but they also are a little cynical and a little jaded and disillusioned by what's happened. And then they see that their lost loved ones are still subplots in the narrative, that they are just written off as prostitutes, as escorts. And so these sisters and mothers have to kind of run defense at the same time that they try to explain how urgent it is to try to solve this case. They have to somehow, they're being asked to explain the decisions of their lost loved ones. And I thought that was just very, very complex and interesting and surprising. And my editor said, well, you've talked to one of the family members already. Why don't you get them all? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, invite them all to New York, put them all in a room together, go round with a microphone and see what they say to each other and see how they compare notes, which was a wonderful idea. And it was a breathtaking experience. And after that story came out, which made it on the cover, then and only then did I see the way toward writing a book. Up until then, the idea of doing a book just on the families with this huge serial killer case seemed a little counterintuitive. But to rewind a little, I'd been wanting to write a book for a while. And I had found that the books I admired the most that were narrative nonfiction were books that sort of lifted the veil on a world that you otherwise wouldn't be a part of or wouldn't understand, and then would help you understand. The one that I loved the most at that time was Random Family by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc, which you could call a crime book, but it really also is almost like a 19th century novel with various plots and subplots and families drifting in and out of trouble. And you care about what happens to everyone. And the crime aspect of it is just part of their lives. And it takes place in among welfare mothers in the Bronx. And so it's a world that I never would have understood otherwise. And I certainly wouldn't have understood it any better if I had read a policy paper about it. It brought things to life in an amazing way. And I realized looking at the magazine story that I had something similar here. I had 5 different families, all from different parts of America, but all within striking distance of New York City, where the women all disappeared. And they all were coming from places that were struggling, that had not rebounded from the 2008 crash, that were in deep trouble and where options had been narrowing. And each of the women were very different in their ways, but they all had the same economic decision to make, which was work 60 hours a week at the Dunkin' Donuts or the Walmart and, never not be able to raise your kid, not be able to, barely survive, or work a few days a month as an escort and make even more money than that. And so they all chose this not because they were addicted to drugs, not because they were social outcasts who had been rejected by their families. They did it because of it was a means towards social mobility. It was a way to solve their economic problems. And that really helped me understand what the book could be. So I sent an email to my agent and I said, normally when a big story of mine comes out, I think maybe it's a book. This is one of those times. What do you think? And my agent said, there's no killer. And that's when it all kind of coalesced for me. I replied very quickly and I said, no. This is a very different kind of book. It's about 5 families. It is the first half of the book could be about the lives of the women, everything that happened before they disappeared. The second half of the book would be everything that happened after their bodies were found. And so it would be, in that way, it was a little like the Executioner's Song, which is like one half one and one half another. My agent replied immediately and said, oh, yeah, sure, that makes sense. And the book sold immediately. And I wrote it really fast, too. And it came out rather quickly. I mean, it wasn't a quickie book. It came out, 2 years after the magazine story. But still, the whole experience of it was a whirlwind, and it was happening as the case was still unfolding. So it was a very high drama, turbulent period for the families that I was writing about. So it was all still very raw and very emotional. When I look back at that time, I think just how troubling and how dark that period was for them, and then to write about it as well.
Amidst that darkness, and also given that they were so disillusioned by this whole entire process, being ignored by the police, having there be so much sort of victim blaming and contempt directed at their daughters and sisters and loved ones, how did you manage to secure their trust as a reporter, as a writer, and sort of get into the stories that really form the heart of the book of who these women were?
It was extraordinarily difficult, because even from the time that I first met them writing the magazine article to a few months later when I started talking about a book with them, their lives had changed. They had been on so many TV shows, and they had taken so much time off of work to come down to New York to talk to Dateline, or to go to visit the community in Long Island where Shannan Gilbert disappeared, and go to a vigil. It had taken over their lives. And so when I turned to them and said, good news, I'd like to write a book about you, most of them were not into it. And it took many, many weeks, and actually a few months for the rest of them, except for Shannan's mother, Mary Gilbert. They all eventually, said it was all right for me to come and interview them. And then almost at my deadline for the first draft, Mary said yes too. So it was tricky, and at the same time, also tricky isn't quite the right word. It was an emotional decision I had to make, because I had to wonder, is this book going to antagonize people who really don't, have been through the ringer? Why would I work on a book if they were against it? And so I had to be very, very careful. And it forced me to do some soul searching early on. I said to myself, well, these women were in their 20s. They weren't children. They had lives apart from their families, and their deaths are public criminal matters. And I thought that the purpose of the book is to humanistically look at these women's lives and the investigations after their deaths. And so as long as I keep my eye on the ball and demonstrate to the families that my motives are that pure, then it should all shake out just fine. And that's essentially what happened. Not everybody who's in the book likes things that are in the book, but in general, the book has sort of stood up as this very clear-eyed, but I guess you could say compassionate or humanistic view of these women. It's not written like an episode of CSI.
Yeah, no, not at all. And, we've talked about how it eschews some of those narrative conventions of true crime, like you need a killer, the victim becomes a secondary player in the whole thing. And this, I'm still grateful for it, because I know, like, even today, sometimes we've run into issues, or there's been issues that we've heard, colleagues run into about publishers or television, programs really wanting kind of a conventional narrative of crime, of like a solved case. And, if it's an unsolved case, it has to have some very clear kind of grabbing hook. And to see, this is kind of a great blueprint on how you can do it differently and do it very well. So
it was tricky. It was not a sure thing. I thought it would be a small book, and that maybe it would be well regarded, but it would not necessarily set the world on fire, because it was not a conventional true crime book. Just as a side note, like, this was 2011, 12, 13 when I was writing the book, and true crime really at that point belonged to basic cable. There was no streaming, there was no prestige true crime. The last prestigious crime book to come out before that was probably Columbine, which had its own very specific situation to write about. The days of like Midnight in the Garden of Evil were like decades ago. So there was a period where I was working on the book thinking, what's the model here? Like, what am I writing? And I was especially worried that the publisher would read my first draft and say, this is great, let's wait for there to be a break in the case so we can have a real ending to this book. And I was thrilled and grateful to be, partnered up with really good editors at HarperCollins who understood what this project was from the very beginning and stayed with it the whole time and never really wavered. And interestingly enough, like I saw that happen again with the development of the Lost Girls movie, that first it went to a big studio, and then the studio was ready to renew it, but it was very, very clear that they were just waiting for a break in the case. And so a very wonderful producer, Kevin McCormick, tore it away from that situation and found a streamer, and then found a whole other streamer when that one streamer also faltered, and finally found Netflix, which was ready to go forward with Liz Garbus's vision for that movie, which was about the women.
One thing that really comes across in the book, and we kind of touched upon this, is like the macro situation that many of these women found themselves in. They're all different. They're all unique individuals. But as you said, there's sort of this background in terms of the economic situation that they found themselves in. And can you speak to that, and perhaps, what might be surprising for folks who don't really know much about the realities of sex work?
When the first 4 sets of human remains were found on Ocean Parkway, there was a very quick report in the Post, I think, that said that the police said that they were sex workers, that they were prostitutes, and that they hadn't identified them yet. And in retrospect, I would wonder how on earth could they possibly know that they were escorts if they hadn't identified them. And it turned out that that one of them, Megan Waterman, was a missing person case that was known to them, and that person, and so one of them was clearly Megan, and so they extrapolated that all 4 of them, since they were in burlap near each other, that they all were escorts. But I didn't know that at the time. Instead, my head went to a very different place, which was every single crime story out there where the story begins with a dead body. And in particular, I thought about season 2 of The Wire, which begins with them opening up a shipping container in the port in Baltimore, and there are all these dead bodies in there, and they are all women who have been trafficked from Eastern Europe. And that's the last we hear of them, and we never learn anything about them or their lives. And my reaction when I saw that news story was, we're never going to learn anything about these women. They were off the grid. They were lost long before they were lost. And so everything that happened after that really showed my biases, and it kind of revealed that my gut reaction was 100% wrong. The families emerged and not only claimed their lost loved ones, but it turned out they'd been looking for them the whole time. The women were not outcasts. They were part of the social fabric of the lives of everybody around them. Some of them had addiction issues. Some of them had child abuse issues. Some of them had bad boyfriends. But there was no universal thing that made it all happen. It's not like some cartel grabbed them. It's not like they all started with a drug, getting addicted to a drug, and then in order to make money for the drug became an escort. Basically, one by one, all of my little assumptions about this world started to crumble. And what I was left with was the social mobility argument, the way that sex work, particularly as it existed online, which was a new thing back then. Smartphones were only a couple years old. Like, people were using, actually, Shannan Gilbert used a netbook, I think, when she was working. Suddenly to be able to be your own boss and to get out from under a pimp and to, make more money than you otherwise would and not, be beholden to anyone. These were revolutionary things that made it even easier and more lucrative for some people to decide to emancipate themselves, essentially, from bad situations, whether it was Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who, in order to, keep custody of her son, needed to make a certain amount of money to pay the rent for her apartment. If she couldn't afford the rent in her apartment, she would lose her son. So does she get a third job, or does she, go escorting for 1 month, from 1 week in a month? And it was a life changer for her. Similarly, Melissa Bartholomew moved to New York, hoping to start a salon. Then actually she did fall under the control of a boyfriend who turned out to be a pimp. But then she liberated herself from him by going on Craigslist and was living alone and was trying to turn her life around at the time that she disappeared. You see it in situation after situation. They all are using the money to solve problems in their life, and it's working for all of them until it doesn't, until suddenly something takes over, whether it's the stress of the job leading to more drug use, or whether it's falling under the control of a bad boyfriend. And then, of course, inevitably, the worst happens to all five of these women. But I wanted to show that arc, and I wanted to, and the this was the other big challenge of the book, that it wasn't just that there was no solution to the mystery. It's that they were five women in similar situations, and how on earth are readers going to differentiate between the five of them? How are we going to understand them all differently? For that, the pressure was all on me. Like to the extent that the book works or doesn't work on that score, it would be the way that I would report and write it. And some and half the editors that we pitched the book to said no because they didn't think it would work, and the other half said sure, it would work. And I think that readers feel that way too, because while Lost Girls certainly has some very nice reviews, there are also lots of readers I see on Amazon who are like, I couldn't tell the women apart. So it's your mileage may vary with this book.
You said that police had contempt for these victims. How did that influence how the investigation played out?
This was something that didn't just occur to me. It occurred to a lot of the journalists who were around. I've been a reporter in New York for 30 years now, so I'd been on for 20 years at that point, and almost. And my wife's a reporter and editor, so we would sit and talk about this case. And the first thing we would say is we would be New York City chauvinists, and we would say, if this case had happened in the New York City limits, it would have been solved 10 minutes ago. Like, there's no reason it should go on this long. And actually, in retrospect, there's a lot, you could make the argument that was really true. But the second thing that we all said was that if these women had been college students at Hofstra, if they had been the daughters of, judges or doctors, if they had been medical students themselves, then this would have been a very different case. The pressure would have been on much more quickly. The police would have been involved much more visibly. There wouldn't be these long lulls and weird bureaucratic snafus that would keep investigations from happening. Shannan Gilbert's 911 call would have been much more quickly connected to the incident that happened at Oak Beach, where she disappeared. Instead of it taking months, it would take hours. Everything would have been faster if these women were in a different social strata. Time and again, the police sort of confirmed this theory. As early as May 2011, the chief of detectives in Suffolk County said something about how it was a consolation that the killer was only selecting from a certain pool of people, which was a poor choice of words, and he has worked to sort of walk it back ever since. But at the time, it kind of stood out as this moment. And it wasn't just the police. I was at one of many press events at Oak Beach, standing with all the rest of the media, and somebody who was working one of the media trucks turned to someone else and said, I can't believe they're doing all this for a whore. So there was just a lot of that, a lot of like, well, they led risky lives, oh yeah, well, they took their risks. This sort of thing can happen, which again, that to me that's something that never occurred to me. Like that's just on the face of it insane. First of all, nobody wakes up thinking they're going to get murdered. But secondly, there are a lot of people with risky professions, and we don't have this kind of contempt for them. You don't say that when a construction worker dies or a police officer dies, or an EMT dies. It's insane. So I felt like a different way of framing the story, looking at their lives would actually be helpful.
I'd like to jump back at something you said at the very beginning of the answer. You said that as a New York City chauvinist, you would sometimes say, oh, if this case happened in New York, it'd be solved 10 minutes ago. And you say there's an argument to be made for that. What is that argument? I'm curious.
Well, it's come out that there was a tip about a car that eventually got connected to our suspect at the moment, to Rex Heuermann. It's clear now that this tip was acquired by the police back in 2011 or 2012. It's unclear exactly what year, but it was back then. And also, it's clear that as early as 2012, the FBI had supplied pretty good cell phone data suggesting that the killer was quite likely someone who lived in central Long Island and commuted to Manhattan, based on things that had been happening with burner phone calls that the women had received. And also, the women's own cell phone activity after they disappeared. And so you could search for the car and for owners who lived in central Long Island and commuted to New York. That's a lot of people, could be thousands of people, but it's a finite number. And a more on the ball police department, like the NYPD, might have just sat down and done it, might have just grabbed the lists and done the work. But it didn't happen that way in Long Island. There are a lot of reasons for that. I'm unpacking it now for a story I'm working on for the Times about this weird mix of politics and corruption and turf battles that kept things like this tip from really being utilized in the way that they should be.
Yeah, can we talk about that more, some of the corruption and power struggle issues? I know you wrote a piece for the Times, I believe in 2020, the Gilgo Beach murders were a cold case, then a new police chief arrived. Can you discuss some of those issues?
Sure. Where to begin? Let's see.
Yeah.
So yeah, in 2020, I wrote something for the Times about a police commissioner who was a breath of fresh air because, among other reasons, she had worked outside of Suffolk County her whole life. She had worked for the FBI her whole career. She was a Long Islander, but she had worked for the FBI. And so the idea of someone from the FBI coming in and running the Suffolk County Police Department was, on paper, a very exciting idea, because this was a police department that, rumor had it, had been resisting the FBI's help in this investigation for years. You may ask, why was this? Why would the Suffolk County Police Department, faced with such a horrible serial killer case, so visible, with so much pressure to solve it, why would they keep the FBI away? And that answer is the kind of like political swamp that might take a beat to really, really unpack. There was a corrupt cop who was very senior in the Suffolk County Police Department. And as soon as he got his job there, all involvement with the FBI and with the state police and with any other outside agency basically screeched to a halt. That guy, turned out to be intensely corrupt. He beat up a witness in a case and then tried to cover it up. He was protected by the district attorney, Thomas Spoda, who it turns out had his own corruption problems, who he was having people followed, having his political enemies monitored, was engaging in what appeared to be blackmail. Both Burke and Spoda ended up prosecuted. Spoda was driven out of office. Burke served time. Someone who served under Spoda is in federal prison right now too, for a lot of, I guess you could call it dirty tricks. Essentially, the police investigation into the Gilgo Beach killings kind of faltered for at least 4 years, from 2012 to 2016. And then once 2016 happened, there was a slow process of trying to clean up the department, and there was pushback. And there's been some good reporting in the Washington Post about that pushback, about outsiders like Tim Sini, who was a police commissioner before the woman Jerry Hart, who I wrote about in the Times. Tim Sini tried, to create a wrongful conviction unit to right wrongs of the past, and that sort of gave him less clout when it came to trying to get the Gilgo Beach investigation going. So it faltered some more. Geraldine Hart came in and she did lots of amazing things. She actually brought in more sophisticated DNA technology, the kind of stuff that had been used in the Golden State Killer case, genetic genealogy, to try to identify more victims. And they identified a new victim, another victim, Valerie Mack. They also made the decision to go public with pieces of evidence in the case that had been held on to stingily by the police for years without involving the public. And so they did some of that. They basically tried to become more transparent, which was great. And then, and only then, once there was a new change of administration, was a task force created that really brought in all these other outside agencies. And one of those outside agencies was the state police. A state trooper, in the very first few weeks of the task force, happened upon this tip about the car, conducted a different kind of background search for the car than had been conducted in the past, and found a hit to an individual, Rex Herman, who lived in central Long Island and commuted into Manhattan. So almost immediately, they had somebody to look at to try to see if perhaps he lined up in other ways. It's astonishing how it went from 0 to 100 so quickly.
I was wondering one thing, now that we have a suspect who's, presumably going to trial over some of these cases. Your book was not a whodunit. It was not a let's look at the suspects or anything like that. But At the time when you were writing it, or even since then, as you've reported on the case, did you have anyone in mind at any time, or were there any prominent suspects among law enforcement who maybe weren't made public? And, I guess, was there anything like that going on in the background?
There were rumors they were looking into a former cop. There were also rumors that one reason why the case was faltering was because these women some of them had clients who had been law enforcement, and so it was kind of a touchy situation for the investigators. These were all rumors. The investigation during the time I wrote Lost Girls was a complete black box. I had maybe one meeting with the police commissioner at the time and his chief of detectives, and they knew that they were about to get fired. So they sort of talked to me for a little while. But apart from that, there really was no insight into what was going on. There were lots of rumors about neighbors at Oak Beach that I get into in the book, about them knowing more about the disappearance of Shannan Gilbert, one of the women, than perhaps they had let on. But in terms of an actual suspect, no, there was, I had nothing. And in fact, I was putting all of my energy into finding out about the lives of the women. I sort of decided, well, I'm never going to get anywhere with the police because they aren't talking to anyone. So I'm going to go in this other direction. And then if there is a break in the case, then that becomes a new ending to the book. But the book stands on its own with or without it.
I have a two-part question for you. One is just, where were you when you heard the news of the arrest? And what's been the reaction from the family so far, if you're still in contact with them?
I was walking my dog in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, and I looked at my phone, and my wife sent me the news alert, and I gasped for air. And what I saw in the news alert was that there had been an arrest. And so that was what really amazed me, because I thought, not a person of interest. Like, it's not like they're bringing someone in for questioning. They have an actual arrest. Like that to me, but I guess what I need to get across is that for 10 years, I've been getting a zillion emails, like, all the time, people saying, I think a guy I met 5 years ago could be the killer. There have been lots of rumors about cases in Atlantic City and other places being connected. Suspects who had been arrested for murdering sex workers out on Long Island, like John Bittroff, and convicted, that, the rumor was that he was perhaps the killer. Another person, James Bissett, who committed suicide on the day that Shannan Gilbert's body was found out in Long Island. People said it was because he knew the police were coming to arrest him. That just the ocean of silly tips was endless. And so to see an actual headline from an actual reputable news organization saying arrest, that I knew it had to be something. And so I kind of went back home and sat at my computer and didn't really get up till midnight. And kind of watched it all unfold. And that kind of leads me to the other part of your question about the families. There was a press conference at the end of the day. The DA and the police commissioner had a press conference, and the only other people up there on the platform behind the podium were family members, were people who I'd met and talked to 10 years ago and hadn't really seen in a while. Some of them I'd seen when the Lost Girls movie came out. But to see them up there on a day like this, it was heartening, because it suggested to me that they knew this was coming, that they'd been looped in, that it wasn't news to them. And that was a position they really hadn't been in for a very long time with the police department. And that was great. And then the DA said all these wonderful things about the families, saying that they represented the best of humanity. And then the police commissioner actually hugged them all. Like, he took a minute and hugged each one of them. And as someone who'd been talking for 10 years about police indifference, about contempt, about, class issues, about misogyny, and about apathy, institutional apathy, it was exciting to see that. It was heartening to see that. I thought, well, this is not nothing. Like, this is something. Like, you could call it lip service, you could call it stagecraft, but it happened. Like, they're actually doing it, which is different from what had happened before. So, my vantage point for so long was, nothing's happening, nothing's going to happen. Things are the same as they were before, and they'll always be this way going forward. And so to see a big change like this was really quite something.
One question I had for you was, I one line and one sort of kind of concept that we really loved in the book gets into, the idea that, people are blaming the internet for what happened to the women. People are blaming their lifestyle. People are blaming, they took on a risky, role in life. And just the idea that, as you wrote, sort of blame can be a trap. And we were wondering if you could talk more about that in the context of when something horrible happens. I think human beings have a tendency to want to blame something or someone. And how can that be a bit of a trap when we're talking about real life crime cases?
I think that when I wrote it, it was basically a media criticism argument. It was about the compulsion we have to jam everything into a prepackaged storyline. So if someone is dead on a true crime show, they're an angel, who's up in heaven, who's who some dark, twisted figure has destroyed. Now, the person who did this may be a dark, twisted figure, but that person was a person. Like you're kind of taking away their humanity by saying that they're an angel, and it actually is not necessarily a dignified position to be calling someone an angel. You're basically turning them into an object. It's a different way of objectifying them. And you could objectify them as a quote unquote prostitute or as a quote unquote angel. And I guess my argument, was that it serves nobody's purpose except perhaps the killer himself to play this game and to kind of fall into this, syntactic trap of saying that that we should blame. There's the other way of blaming, the misogynist way of blaming it, like blaming them for having risky lifestyles that led to their deaths, or absolving them of blame entirely. Instead of wondering about how much of this was their fault, perhaps wonder what made them vulnerable, perhaps wonder why the rest of us neglected them, perhaps wonder why when they were leading risky lifestyles, they didn't have enough support. And then wonder, once they decided to enter sex work, they had no recourse if they felt in danger. And then wonder why, once they disappeared, their Johns never seemed to get into trouble. And then, wonder why, once the families campaigned to have their missing persons cases taken seriously, they weren't. These are things that are worth wondering about. But to sit and wonder about blaming, why'd she do it? Was it because she had a drug problem? Was it because she wanted to impress her mother? Like, these aren't the questions.
Lately, of course, the press seems to be going into a bit of a tizzy, for lack of a better word, about the arrest and upcoming trial. As the press starts to focus on these, are there things they're missing? Are there things they should be looking at instead?
It's been interesting so far. Part of it's been really predictable. As you said, like, everybody's wondering about this guy, and of course he's fits into a very easy storyline of this, even the police commissioner called him a demon, someone, and the fact that he was hiding in plain sight and living in a suburb, and that he had a family and a secret double life. Like, it's all very cinematic. But and so I, part of me feels like that's natural. I mean, he's news. Like, you're going to pay attention to somebody because he's news. But I do think that the other question here deserves attention too, which is what took so long? Why weren't the dots connected sooner? What really was why was he able to operate for years completely without scrutiny? And I guess, to be completely honest, I think that those questions are being asked pretty well now too. I don't think people are ignoring that. So I guess time will tell, if a trial comes along, whether there'll be, which direction it'll go, whether it'll be about him as a monster, as a Hannibal Lecter or something like that, or whether it'll be about, how did the system break down?
Some questions that remain for us, I know, and some of our listeners, involve some of the other victims that have not been directly connected with Rex Heuermann at this point. Some, Valerie Mack, you mentioned, and some who haven't even been identified yet, like Peaches and her child. And, we don't even know their identities, obviously. But do you have any thoughts on those, and whether we might be hearing more, or now that some of them have been identified, if their families are getting involved? I mean, it's just, I know people, it's sort of like two awful possibilities that they're victims of Heuermann, who, of course, innocent until proven guilty, obviously, or that there's another
killer out there who's, killing other people in vulnerable situations. And do you have any thoughts on those victims?
It was a bit of a letdown when he pleaded not guilty. There's the Joel Rifkin storyline, and I guess there are others as well, where they get caught and they say, yeah, and I'll tell you who else I killed, and I'll show you where I put them. And suddenly there are all sorts of answers. And so it was clear that wasn't going to happen this time. That is a shame. And so, yeah, we're left wondering if these other women are even connected at all. I find it hard to believe that this guy quit. I would think that perhaps, before these 4 women and after, there have been others, but I'm no expert. I'm not I'm not law enforcement. That's just me trying to think about a storyline. That I guess if you were to ask me right now, I'd say that the others might be attributable to a different killer or killers, just because the means of the way that the bodies were disposed of and handled are so different. But that there's always been this theory that the killer evolved, that he started doing things one way and then ended up doing things a different way, perhaps because he had more time on his hands, or suddenly had the availability of Craigslist to try and find people who he exactly could deal with the way he wanted to deal with them.
Do you think Shannan Gilbert was the victim of a homicide?
At this point, I'm fairly sure that she's not connected to the serial killer case. And I don't believe her death is necessarily a homicide, but I'd still believe that the neighbors know more than what they're saying, that she didn't just disappear that morning, that something else happened, that either she had, some sort of medical crisis that they either did or didn't try to interfere with, and then, work to make sure that she got disappeared before the police could get involved. There are a couple of different scenarios. Some of them involve her driver, Michael Pack, and others involve neighbors. But I just, I've been to that marsh in the spring, and I've seen how impossible it is to penetrate. And it's hard to believe that one small woman could have gotten hundreds of yards into that marsh by herself and then, died. If she, if it did happen that way, I guess it's possible, but it seems more likely to me that it was another scenario.
We've talked a bit about why this case, may have taken so long to solve, and the problems with law enforcement, and, how this was handled, the lack of willingness to accept help from outside agencies. Are there any other factors that you felt contributed to the delay in these victims receiving justice?
So all along, I'd been wondering whether it was apathy or incompetence or corruption. Those were the 3 that I was wondering about what was going on with the police. And it turns out there was a little bit of apathy combined with resentment, I guess, that such a high profile series of cold cases would crash land into their jurisdiction, and suddenly they'd be expected to work a miracle and solve it. Maybe they got very defensive and had a bunker mentality. And then there was a little bit of a competence problem, that there were certain things like cell tower analysis that they just were not interested in doing in an efficient way, which is just shocking. And then running through the lists of residences of people who might be commuters, it's just another thing they didn't, bother with because they thought it wasn't worth it. And then corruption, we have Burke and Spoda and all of that stuff. But I guess, can we, now that there's a suspect, now that there's someone arrested, and we have a scenario where he was able to operate for so long, can we add to that list? I do not think that, assuming he's guilty, Rex Heuermann is a criminal mastermind. I think he apparently used a roll of tape that was lying around the house and had his and his wife's genetic material on it. And he apparently used a belt that might have had a family member's set of initials on it and left it at the crime scene. Like I think he was lucky in a lot of ways that police weren't looking for him. I guess the other thing I would add is some sort of structural bias that everybody's looking for. Even the police are looking for somebody who is some sort of criminal mastermind or some sort of super genius who knows how to evade them. And then there are others who are looking for someone who's a globe-trotting killer who goes up and down the eastern seaboard or across the country and does it by season to season. And everybody's thinking bigger, nobody's thinking smaller. I'd always thought that the killer would be someone more like Joel Rifkin, who was just a loner who was existing and evading scrutiny. And the fact that it might be someone like Rex Heuermann, who was not a loner, who had a family, who lived in a densely populated suburb, who had a pretty high profile job, who interacted with lots of well-resourced people in New York City. The fact that all of that happened, I think that should probably cause a little more soul searching among people who were floating scenarios that the guy was a some sort of genius who knew how to evade detection.
Yeah, that is one true crime narrative that we wish would, kind of go out of fashion. The idea that everything has to be huge and everything has to be Hannibal Lecter, because you've seen this in your own reporting. We've seen this in the reporting we've done, but frequently people who are doing, vicious acts like this are not geniuses, and the truth is a lot more boring in some ways than.
Has reporting on this case changed the way you view crime?
I have a lot more of appreciation for the echo chamber and how it warps people's perceptions, because let's take an example from what we were talking about a moment ago. So you have someone like James Burke, who was powerful in the police department, and he beat up a witness, and apparently in his past he had consorted with sex workers. So he's a cop who has not a typical cop's lifestyle and is engaging in criminal behavior, and is sort of somehow allowed to rise up in the police force anyway because he has powerful friends and good buddies, and he keeps going, right? So if we're to think big about this, we could say, well, one reason why he's doing this is because he's the serial killer, right? And then so people start talking about it, and the echo chamber mills around until finally it becomes not an accepted fact, but at least something that such a big part of the conversation that people can then start saying, well, okay, so if he wasn't the killer, maybe he was hooked in with the same sex workers who were linked to this case. And that's why that would explain why the case, dragged out so much, which would be a wonderful movie. But again, doesn't necessarily reflect, reality. And then, people talk about that for so much. The echo chamber bangs that around so much that even if you don't believe that, you believe it when somebody surfaces and makes a claim that Burke attended a sex party in Oak Beach once 10 years ago, where everybody was on drugs and seeing sex workers. And to place him at Oak Beach, whether or not it even happened, which God knows if it even happened, that would suggest that he was part of a huge cover-up, with Shannan Gilbert, that he worked very hard over time behind the scenes to protect the huge conspiracy of criminality where Shannan Gilbert disappeared. And so but enough people talk about it that suddenly it becomes an article of faith. People say, oh, yes. Well, of course, we all know that Burke covered up for the killer. And I'm much more attuned to that now than I was when I started working on this stuff.
Yeah, really well said. It's a situation. I feel like there's a tendency, even, in situations when law enforcement doesn't solve a high profile case immediately, there's a leap to, oh, it's a cover up, it's a conspiracy. And in this situation, it certainly seems like the evidence points to Burke certainly being a corrupt, problematic, leader of law enforcement in this area. But as you said, then that leaps into sex parties. Everyone's connected. He covered it up, and that's highly problematic. And unfortunately, it's endemic in the true crime genre, because I think there's a tendency to want to go with the most interesting story instead of where the evidence lies, or acknowledging that corruption happens and may certainly have played a role in this case if there was a James Burke kind of maybe not wanting the FBI coming in because they might start looking at some of what he was doing. But
and I mean, if you're a detective and you're using deductive reasoning, I guess it makes sense for you to float a theory and then try to disprove it, right? But I've never, maybe it makes me a bad crime writer, but I've never been a deductive reasoner. I've always been an inductive reasoner. I've always kind of tried to work from the ground up and base all decisions based on what I see already. And I don't think, well, let's say so-and-so was the killer. How might that have happened? I don't engage in that kind of thinking. And I think it probably takes all kinds. And there probably are wonderful reporters out there who wonder, maybe the president was involved in the Watergate break-in. I'm going to try and figure out if he does or wasn't. But that's not me. That's not the way that I go. And so when people came to me and said, I want to try and figure out if Burke is involved in this or not, my initial reaction was it's kind of an impossible thing to disprove, right? Like no matter what you come up with to show that he wasn't connected, there might be some other fantastical, other thing out there that connects him to him that you don't know about. So you would never be able to completely disprove it. So merely by asking the question, you're potentially going down a huge rabbit hole.
We've talked about some of the lingering questions in this case about Shannan Gilbert, about the other victims, and about why it took so long for law enforcement to crack this. I'm curious, are there any other questions that you still have that you would possibly want to see answered through a trial?
Everyone's talking about this tip about the Chevy Avalanche, this car that was spotted outside where Amber Costello lived the night before she disappeared. The nature of this tip is interesting because it apparently comes from an individual who was not necessarily taken seriously by police back then, and that police might have had good reason. I really would love to know more about when this guy was questioned, what else they talked about, because I think that hindsight is 20/20, and it's very easy for someone like me to stand up and say the police ignored the crucial tip. But what if there were 10,000 other tips that day? Or what if the guy who was giving them the tip had some problems that the police couldn't ignore? I would love to know the real circumstances of how all this happened, and then how the tip disappears for 10 years.
You mentioned you're working on something for the Times for this. I just wondered generally what is next for you? Are you going to continue covering the story?
I'm proud to be consulting on Liz Garbus's upcoming documentary about the case. That doesn't really put me like working on it full time or anything, but I'm glad to be a resource for them going forward. And yeah, I'll do after the story with the Times. I guess we'll see. I don't think I foresee having a like a Dominic Dunn kind of role, like sitting at the trial and blogging every day, or like that's not something I would necessarily want to do. I do see the conversation moving away from what Lost Girls focused on and towards something that perhaps other crime reporters might be equally, well positioned to do. So I don't necessarily feel like I, will be full time on this forever.
And this has been a wonderful conversation, and we just want to say again, we really appreciate your time and insight, Bob. Is there anything that we didn't ask you about that you think it's important for the listeners to understand the case, the women at the center of this case, your work, or anything else?
My sense is that the families connected to this case, by and large, have been exhausted for a very long time by it. That they are, I was talking actually to some law enforcement who talked about meeting with the families, and that they would talk about how the conversations with them these days become, are sort of normal, but then suddenly at some point a corner turns and they have to sort of relive it all over again, and they become very, very tense, and it's all really, really rough. And so I think that the fact that there's been an arrest has to be pretty heartening for them, but of course there is no closure, and it just sort of perhaps helps them grieve a different way, to grieve differently, to have some sort of semblance of an answer might ease their grief. That's been on my mind a lot.
We want to thank Bob for taking the time to speak with us. We'll include a link to buy Lost Girls in our notes.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks